So the first thing to say about the Gülen movement is that it's unique. It's hard to understand because it looks like some other Islamic movements, but in actual fact, when you look at the substance, it's very different. So some people, and there are still some critics who make this point, say that it does the same things as Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin. You know, it's into social welfare, and therefore it must have the same intentions. But actually, it's true. It does some of the same things, but its intentions are very different. It's not the same. It's not coming from the same philosophical position. It's in particular opposed to Islamist politics in Turkey and generally. It's coming from a different philosophic position. It rejects a coercive attempt to impose religion on people through the state. In fact, Fethullah Gülen has been very emphatic about this, and the movement is coherent. So when he makes a statement, it's a statement which is generally considered broadly across the movement. There's not a lot of debate on this. His position is very clear. He's led on this, that to understand Islam as a totalizing system is the wrong way of understanding Islam. To try and impose Islam by force is the wrong way, which of course is the Islamist vision. So although there's no question the movement engages with a section of traditional society that's in many cases recently urbanized and is in that sense socially conservative, it's not seeking radical change in society, and it's not reactionary. Its philosophy is geared towards individual development. And so the key theme emerging through the movement is that it believes that in conducting its understanding of da'wah, of outreach and teaching, its primary mode of conveying the message is through tamsil, through example, not through preaching, not through tabligh. It's a very different approach to, if we can call this da'wah, it's a very different approach to da'wah than many Islamic movements. We need to understand the context of where this movement sprang from. Turkey, of course, is very much shaped by French laicism, so French understandings of laicity have shaped a Turkish approach to secularism. And one of the curious things about the French approach to laicity in the Turkish context is that it not only argues very strongly for an extreme understanding of secularism, it takes on itself an understanding that the state is responsible for how people express themselves religiously, and therefore not only has the Kemalist revolution in Turkey modelled an understanding of Islam which must be sort of confined to the private and carefully curtailed, the state is in charge of Islam. And we see that in the structure of the Diyanet and structure of Turkish state relations. So it's a very different approach to how a state interacts with the religious community. So the state, in a sense, has succumbed to the same response to religion in the state as the Islamists have. It believes that there must be control, and you can control people's religious understanding. My point here is that the Gülen movement takes a very contrary view. It doesn't believe that you can enforce an understanding. It doesn't believe in a coercive approach to religion. For Fethullah Gülen and his understanding, as I said, is very coherently expressed through the movement. So we can most often assume that when he makes and articulates a particular position, that it's a broadly held position in the movement. For Gülen, learning is at the core of what he feels that his community is responsible for in the world. And his approach to learning is one of revelation, of course. It's based on religious belief, but also of reason and the heart. And what's interesting is that for Fethullah Gülen, learning is not just an instrumentalist means of promoting religion, and learning is not simply about religion. Learning is in of itself valuable. So you don't have to be talking about religion as a teacher, and you don't have to be learning directly about religion as a student for the learning experience itself to be valuable. It's an end in itself. It's also part of a greater project. He's very much concerned with self-development. So if you think of some of the statements about this theme which have been expressed in the Western context, and my own position is as a Protestant Christian, so I'm speaking to you frankly about a particular perspective. We've had people say things like, these are the words of Fethullah Gülen, but we've had similar expressions from many Christian philanthropists involved in education. Gülen says that neglect of the intellect would result in a community of poor, docile mystics. Negligence of the heart or the spirit, on the other hand, would result in a crude rationalism devoid of any spiritual dimension. It's only when the intellect, spirit, and body are harmonized and man is motivated towards activity in the illuminated way of the divine message that he can become a complete being and attain the true humanity. This really encapsulates the core of Gülen's philosophy. What's interesting here, though, is the same things could have been said by somebody like the American Christian intellectual Jonathan Edwards, also a preacher, or John Wesley, or many Jesuit teachers. I mean, it's I don't know the Catholic tradition as well, but there are many educational philanthropists coming from a Christian tradition, I think also from a Jewish tradition, from other traditions, that would say something similar. My point is to suggest that from a European perspective, we shouldn't see this as being other and different and alien. It's part of, in many ways, common projects across humanity. Of course, the movement and Fethullah Gülen himself are concerned with a kind of bridging exercise. There's an exercise here in trying to reconcile two worlds. There's a world that's the world of traditional village Anatolia. This, of course, is being overly simplistic, but that world is a world that has historically been based on rote learning. It's been based on social conservatism. It's been about an uncritical approach to education. And that's being reconciled with a world of globalized modernity in which students today are encouraged to think critically, they're encouraged to engage, they're encouraged to adopt a cosmopolitan perspective. So, in terms of Islamic concepts of learning, there's a world of taqlid, of tasawwuf, of tabligh, being reconciled with a world of ijtihad, or tajdid, or taqliyam. It appears paradoxical. I don't believe it's paradoxical, but the point is that many of the hard to understand aspects of the movement come from this bridging across two quite different worlds. That's also, I think, the source of vitality for the movement. If it was just a modern movement, it wouldn't have this vitality, it wouldn't have this depth. And the reason it has such depth in Turkish society and beyond is because it's tapping into traditional Islamic consciousness and traditional Islamic communities and finding a way out, opening a pathway to engage with modernity. I think that's what makes it really vital. Some people, such as famously Hakan Yavuz, have described the movement as being Turkish Puritans, and there is some truth in that. If you understand the Puritan tradition well, it's often used in a disparaging way. But I think the point about trying to make these connections is that in Europe and the Western tradition, we've become accustomed to this division, of course, made most famous by Samuel Huntington, but there long before that Islam is something other, exotic and different. It has a different narrative, a different story. It's coming from a different direction. My argument is when you look at the Gülen movement, you see so many striking parallels. And I think it's appropriate to see those parallels with things which, from a Western point of view, are familiar. There's many shared values and experiences. In terms of Gülen and his background, his own training was theologically trained in the Imam Hatip system, worked as an imam, retired in 1981, and that retirement coincided with a time because the revolution of 1980 and the new government of Turgut Özal in 1983 gave an opportunity for the movement, which was at this stage rather hidden and quiet and low-key, focused on engaging with students in summer camps and dormitories, study groups, to, as it were, going public. And this is when the school system started. And it enabled the movement to become a civil society movement. It's today best known for its schools and colleges. It's thought to have at least 1,000 schools. No one can give a definitive list because the movement is structured in a very organic fashion that makes centralized lists impossible. As you would probably know, it began with one school in the 1980s in Izmir, quickly spread to Istanbul, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union opened opportunities in Central Asia, and then from there, of course, not so long after that, here in Albania and elsewhere. Some of those connections are logical because they're connections into the former Ottoman Empire territory, domain, but the movement has been active in other parts of Asia and parts of Africa where there's no historical connection. It's because of a sense of vision. Of course, also, we're now seeing universities as part of this, this vision. there's a sense in which this movement, which is certainly philanthropic and certainly based on volunteer activity, you can describe in some ways in the language of da'wah, of Islamic preaching and teaching, and in some ways in the language of, to use an English term, missions. But we have to be very careful with these terms because they can easily lead to misunderstanding. But they are valuable in that we understand the movement is based on volunteerism and sacrificial service. Service is, well, the word I'm sure you all know. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, but let me rehearse my outline because maybe it's useful as a way of explaining to others. The word service, Turkish, is often used for the movement. Hizmet is used to describe the movement itself because it's a movement based very much on personal service. And it's a service that's played out through example, through tamsil, rather than preaching. And it's not about, as with missions in the West, we think of conversion. It's not about conversion. It's about trying to engage individuals and give them opportunities to develop and be lifted up. There are other activities in the Turkish context that are very instrumental. In the world of business and business networks, the movement has its financial base in terms of seeding capital from associations of businessmen, and that plays a direct role in terms of financing the movement and directing it. It's also been very much engaged, apart from education, in publishing. So it's initiated, beginning at the time of Turgut Özal's government, when there was greater openness. It initiated things like Fountain magazine, Zaman newspaper, or online as today, Zaman, which of course is now increasingly a global concern, Aksiyon news magazine, Samanyolu television. These were all initiatives when they were launched that looked financially very dubious. It wasn't clear at the time that there were good business bases for having these initiatives. It's turned out that the business acronym, or the business sort of insight behind launching these movements was very sharp and very prescient. But they were launched not to make profit, they were launched in order to make a change. We've also had, of course, we have publishing which is directly religious. So the Ishik publishing and related companies is directly publishing religious material. Fethullah Gülen's own books, the works of Said Nursi, Risale Nur, and so on. But these things are separate. The work of Samanyolu television station or Zaman newspaper is secular. There's a plethora, a diversity of voices being expressed. Some of them here on this panel in journals or newspapers like Zaman, and it's not. It's not meant to smuggle in religious ideas. It's a separate project. Let me conclude very quickly. There's parallels, I think, with Western models along these lines. But something like Zaman can only be understood as a genuine attempt to create a newspaper of record because of a desire to fill a gap in Turkish society. There's thirdly been major initiatives in dialogue and engagement through civil society. The Writers and Journalists Foundation is perhaps most instrumental here. In terms of trying to understand this movement, then it is literally unique, and it's a progressive Islamic movement that's transnational. All other Islamic movements that are transnational are either conservative or reactionary. This is indeed a progressive movement. I think it's helpful in conclusion to understand the philanthropic basis of this movement in the language made popular most recently by Muhammad Yunus, the founder of Grameen Bank. Muhammad Yunus spoke about the idea of social business. He said, if you want to change society, start a business that brings about the change that you want. The business doesn't exist for the reasons of profit, the business exists for reasons of being self-sustaining. The business exists because it wants to bring about social change, but because it's got a sound business model, it can carry on endlessly, whereas philanthropy, pure philanthropy, is limited to when the capital runs out. So the Gülen movement, I think, is very much a movement that understands this idea that Muhammad Yunus has expressed quite separately and says, if we just rely upon charitable giving, we'll hit the wall very quickly, we'll run out of resources. But if we can find a business model for making this self-sustaining, take that charitable giving as seed capital, invest it, get the school going, get the newspaper going, and then move on to another venture. This can carry on endlessly, and I think that's been the secret of the movement, in that it's moved away from just depending upon charitable giving and has set a business foundation. But the impetus, the vision remains a philanthropic vision of bringing about social change, and it's not a vision, I think, which is unique to the Muslim world, and it's not alien to Christian Europe. It's very much part of a parallel endeavour, and it should be understood as such. And I think if we understand it as such, we'll get a better understanding and a deeper insight. At least that's my biased sort of Western Christian perspective, but I offer it with sincerity and a genuine respect for the movement. Thank you.